Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Coffin. I am AFT's National Agricultural Land Network Director and Senior Policy Advisor. Thank you all for joining us today. We're delighted to have you all. We have a very diverse group of folks on this call who are joining us in this webinar, a group of land trusts, county, state, and federal agency staff, AFT program staff, and many others. So thank you all for joining us today. As you can see, I am joined here with a great group of panelists, and we will introduce them right after our at the beginning of our panel discussion. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping rules. Number one, everyone has been muted, so no need to mute yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an orange arrow at the top of that panel that allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a question section of that control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square. That decouples it from the control panel, and then you can type your question or comment in there. And as you can see, we've designed this webinar to be primarily a discussion, and we will have lots of time for Q&A. We are recording the webinar. We will send the recording out to everyone who is registered. Please feel free to share that. For all of those questions that we don't get around to, if we don't get around to them, we will be doing a follow-up Q&A. So again, feel free to ask questions. We are also we may do an advanced BiProtect Cell 201, and so we have some poll questions sort of designed to understand both the level of knowledge and engagement already in BiProtect Cell now and what more information and technical assistance you might like in the future. So we're going to start right now with a very quick poll. Just to gauge what people's level of experience is with BiProtect Cell. If you are having any difficulty voting in the poll, it may be that you were in full screen mode and you need to toggle out of that to be able to participate. So let's take a minute for people to answer that poll question. Okay, Beth, do we have? Great. Okay, that is very helpful. Thank you, everybody, for that. Okay, with that, we are going to start with an introduction to BiProtect Cell from American Farmland Trust President and CEO John Piatti. Some of you may know that before he came to AFT, John was the president of Maine Farmland Trust, and at Maine, at MFT, started their portfolio and work in BiProtect Cell. So we are going to start with a video of him, again, because his internet is not always as great as it is for many of us. Our internet is not so great, but we thought it would be better to ensure that people could hear and see him by starting off with a video. So we're going to start with that. That is a 10-minute introduction to BiProtect Cell and what got John and Maine Farmland Trust into this line of work. And then we're going to come back and introduce the panelists. So with that, Beth, if you can start the video, that would be great.
When you were president of Maine Farmland Trust, you launched a robust BiProtect Cell program. What is BiProtect Cell, and why did you begin to do BPS projects in Maine?
Well, Buy Protect Sell is an alternative tool for land protection. Generally, when you're a land trust trying to protect land, you work with a landowner who either sells or donates an easement. And that means that it requires that you have a willing landowner. But what happens when there's a piece of property that's about to go on the market, when the landowner is not in a position to consider an easement but has to sell? Buy, Protect, Sell, as the name implies, allows a land trust to buy the property, protect it itself, and then turn around it and resell it. And there's a couple of great things that happen when you do this. One, you can target the property that you would argue is the most vulnerable, the property that's about to go on the market. But the second reason is you then create property that can be provided affordably to incoming farmers. And we launched this program in Maine precisely to serve those two goals. We were missing out on protecting key properties, that which was the most vulnerable, and we had a real goal of helping farmers, both existing farmers who maybe needed to expand or acquire property that they leased and was critical to their operation, or new farmers who were trying to enter the field.
Where did the idea of BPS come from?
Well, it's not a new concept. When we launched the program in Maine in 2008, in Vermont they were doing it. I think there were some land trusts in Pennsylvania that were doing it. Our model, though, came from one of our board members, a farmer who a decade earlier had purchased some properties himself and then worked with a local land trust to protect them, and then turned around and sold those properties to young farmers in the area. So that's where we got the idea. So we weren't the first, we can't take credit for it, but we did create what ended up being, I think, one of the biggest programs in the country. During the last 6 years that I was at Maine Farmland Trust, we did about 30 deals, and that work continues. And we also had a hand in spreading the concept to other land trusts around the country.
What challenges did you encounter? What lessons did you learn?
Well, the biggest challenge is really making the numbers work. I used to joke with my board that Buy, Protect, Sell was the buy high, sell low program, and that's an accurate way of describing it. So there's a huge challenge in purchasing a property that you may be spending 2 times, 3 times, 5 times more on purchasing it than you can ultimately turn around and resell it for. So that's critical, and you need a plan from the beginning on how you're going to do that. So one of the lessons learned is that you need to scrutinize each project very carefully and come up with a financial plan that will work for it. Another lesson which relates to that is the need to sort of take a portfolio approach. Some projects are going to lose money. Some projects are going to maybe make a little money. You have to look at it as an overall portfolio with the goal that overall we're going to break even on this. If you focus just on individual projects and one goes bad, you think you've failed, but you haven't. The goal, again, is ultimately to protect the land and make it affordable for the next generation of farmers. If that costs you a little bit of money, that's okay, but you have to overall have a financial viability for the program so you can continue to do it.
How and from where did you raise the needed funds?
We raised money in many different ways. And again, that's sort of part of how this stuff works. The way I've always thought about Buy, Protect, Sell is with 2 different funding streams. First, you need money in order to buy the property. And then you also need money to cover the difference in costs between what you pay for it and what you might have to invest in it while you own it and what you ultimately sell it for. And those two sort of buckets of expenses are interrelated, right? Because if you, for instance, pay interest on money that you're using to buy the farms, that adds to the overall cost. But I really like to think of them separately. And when you look at the first bucket of the capital costs for a project, we were really lucky in Maine. We had a lot of socially conscious investors who lent us money at very low rates. And then we filled in the rest where needed with either bank loans or with some of our own capital. On filling the gap between what we pay for a property and spend on it and what we bring in when we sell it, most of the cost there, not all, but most of the cost there is the cost of the easement itself. So government sources of funding for easements is one answer. The other answer is we would do project-specific fundraising to try to fill that gap. Get people in a community who are excited about a deal to put in some money to see this property that they cared about permanently protected. But we couldn't do that always, and there wasn't government funding available always. So we also raised general philanthropic money, grant funding and the like, to help pay for general operating costs for the program, and to then target those worthy projects that we wanted to do, but nonetheless we'd never be able to find easement-specific funding from government or private sources for.
Didn't the 2018 Farm Bill make it possible to use federal funds for BPS deals?
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the great accomplishments of the 2018 Farm Bill. Prior to that, I just mentioned how government funding for easements is a critical piece of this, but the federal funding was not available for BPS projects, at least not directly. So that was put forward in the 2018 Farm Bill. It's a great success. That was 2 years ago, but it takes a while to promulgate rules, and this is a new area for NRCS. So they have been in discussions with us and others about how to do this well. I can say that the leadership at NRCS is very excited about this new authority, and I think they're very close to issuing rules on it. And when they do, we will be sharing that information with you.
Where does BPS fit among different tools in the Farmland Protection Toolbox?
Well, BPS, in my mind, is a critical tool because it allows you to do some things that you can't do otherwise. One of the key things that you can do with BPS is you can target farmland, as I mentioned earlier, where there isn't a landowner who's ready to work with you on an easement. So it opens up a whole different set of projects that have never been available before. And as I also mentioned earlier, it also gives you that opportunity to target that most vulnerable land, the land that's about to go on the market. The second reason the tool is very powerful is because what it can do to open up opportunities for farmers to buy land at affordable costs. Those of us in the land protection business always think every land protection deal will ultimately result in farmland changing hands at more affordable costs. But that might be years, it might be decades before a farmer who you worked with an easement on their property turns around and sells it or passes it along to their children or whatever. But with a BPS project, that happens almost immediately. So it's a very powerful tool.
I hear you were surprised when you learned that the actual term, buy, protect, sell, was being incorporated into the Farm Bill. Tell me about that.
Well, it's a little bit embarrassing in a way. I was the new president of AFT, and we were gearing up for our involvement with the 2018 Farm Bill. And a lot of my energy was devoted elsewhere. I had good staff working on the Farm Bill. I didn't need to pay a lot of attention to it. And I didn't even realize that AFT was working with a group of land trusts to advance buy, protect, sell in the Farm Bill, or that they were using that term, buy, protect, sell. And the reason that's funny is because I coined that term. And I used to go around in Maine and talk about this great program that we had with a terrible name. And I used to say, well, it might be a bad name, but at least it's descriptive because it says that we buy the land, we protect it, and then we sell it again. And I guess everybody hopes that they'll be remembered for something professionally, and maybe for me, this is it. Now I have this term that I coined, memorialized in the federal Farm Bill. I just wish I had come up with a better name before it ended up in federal legislation.
Well, thank you very much for sharing this information.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And I think we are all back now. So now what I'm going to do is give each of our panelists a chance to do a very short overview of the engagement of their land trust, or in the case of Susan, her state agency, with Buy, Protect, Sell. So without any further ado, let me start. First up is Adam Bishop, who is the Farmland Protection Program Director with Maine Farmland Trust. Adam?
Great, thank you, Chris. So yeah, everybody, I'm Adam. I'm the Farmland Protection Program Director at MFT. I've been in this position for almost 8 years now. Maine Farmland Trust is a statewide land trust in Maine that's been working on farmland protection since 1999. You can go to the next slide, Beth or Chris. Our organization is now up to having protected 323 farms permanently, either by MFT or through our involvement with another organization, protecting over 50,000 acres of land with conservation easements. You know, we at MFT purchase conservation easements, we work with donated easements, and as John said in his introduction, we've been doing Buy, Protect, Sell projects for a number of years. We're up to 44 completed Buy, Protect, Sell projects that's led to the protection of more than almost 12,000 acres of farmland. And we have also been able to make over 230 links through our Maine Farm Link program, matching up owners of farmland with seekers of farmland. And oftentimes our BPS projects get matched to the buyers of the property through that program. So it's still a very active tool for us, something that we continue to use every year, and we continue to learn about it as we go. So I'll stop there, Chris, but thank you for having me on the panel and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Adam. Okay, next up is Maggie. Maggie Donnan is the Farmland Access Program Manager with Vermont Land Trust.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. I have been with the Land Trust I just had my 1-year anniversary a couple days ago. So really happy to be in this position. And the Vermont Land Trust mission is that current and future generations are deeply connected to the land and benefit from its deliberate and responsible stewardship. So we've conserved about 2,000 parcels of land, totaling about 590,000 acres, encompassing about 11% of the state. Yeah, you can go on, Chris. That's fine. Beth, whoever's the next slide. Yeah. So and one of the pieces of work that we do, my day-to-day, is our farmland access program. And so the goal of that program is to connect farmers with affordable land access opportunities using a variety of tools. Buy, Protect, Sell being one of them. And also with that work, supporting local communities and local food production, promoting the long-term productive use of farmland, and tried to include some photos of some of our farmland access projects here. You can go to the next slide. And so we've really had a 20+ year commitment to farmland access, and specifically to the work of buying properties, protecting them, and then transitioning them to new and beginning farmers or current farmers who are looking to expand. So since the early 2000s, we've done about 100 farmland access projects. We've utilized about more than $5 million of outside capital to finance those acquisitions. That sort of first bucket of funding that John was talking about in his video, which encompassed about 32 farm acquisitions at 5,000 acres. And so, Buy, Protect, Sell is one of the tools that we use, but we also use new conservation acquisitions, retroactive options to purchase, local fundraising, linking, and landowner support. all, encompassed within our greater farmland access work. So, and we have a goal of doubling that work in the next 10 years to ideally place 200 new and beginning farmers on land in Vermont. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Next we go to Susan. Susan is the Executive Director of the State of New Jersey's Department of Agriculture, State Agriculture Development Committee. That's quite a mouthful, but when you hear me say SADC, you'll know that that is the short for that committee. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for having me. Just a quick snapshot of New Jersey's Farmland Preservation Program. We started actually in 1985 was our first transaction, and it was a buy, protect, sell transaction by Burlington County that the state provided cost share funds for. So kind of prior to 1999, we had intermittent bond issuances as funding source, but in 1999, major funding really kicked in. And so this map just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of kind of where we are in the state in terms of preserving our land base. Go to the next slide. So where we are, we have about 750,000 acres of farmland in New Jersey. We've preserved about 240,000 acres of that. So about a third of all of our farmland has been entered into our program, and about 43% of our goal. So we're about getting close to halfway there. Buy, protect, sell has been a tool that we've used over the years. I took a look at our records. I think the SADC has participated in just under 80 buy, protect, sell deals, and we do that two ways. The first is when my agency itself, the State Ag Committee, deals directly with the landowner, and we buy it in fee, hold it, and then sell it subject to our deed of easement. So, and that's where most of those transactions have happened. We've done about 61 of those ourselves. And then the other way is that we give grants to counties and to nonprofit organizations for them to do buy, protect, sell. So we give a 50% grant to a county or a nonprofit to purchase the land in fee. So we are in for 50% of the fee, but then we are in for 50% of the proceeds when they sell it. So we kind of recapture some of our investment upon the sale, and there's regulations that deal with that. But so I think I'll stop there. We'll get to the rest of the detail, I think, as we go through the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. Next, we are going to Robin. Robin Fay is Senior Conservation Manager with the Washington Farmland Trust. So, Robin?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. As Chris mentioned, I'm the Senior Conservation Manager with Washington Farmland Trust. We're a statewide land trust out in Washington State that works specifically with farm and ranch land. And we're relatively new to buy, protect, sell projects compared to, I think, the rest of the folks here. I just have to give a shout out to Maine Farmland Trust and Vermont Land Trust. I haven't worked with either of you two personally, but I know that our staff has drawn on your staff extensively to really get a baseline knowledge of how these projects work. And we've done 2 buy, protect, sell projects to date, which not a lot of projects, but it does represent a significant chunk of the acreage we've conserved. About 20% of the acreage we've conserved has been through these 2 larger buy, protect, sell projects. So we've been learning a tremendous amount as we go through this process, and I'm really happy to share. And I should share, we actually haven't sold either yet. So really we haven't completed one yet. We're really in the thick of it, and have learned a tremendous amount. And it's been a really valuable experience, both in being able to create some large conservation wins, and also just really pushing our organization to learn and perfect some new tools that I think will help us throughout our program. So yeah, really happy to be part of the group today. If you want to go to the next slide, I'll just touch really briefly. So this was our first project that we took on using this model. We purchased the fee interest in 2016 for just under $3 million, using our own capital and then also a bridge loan from the Conservation Fund. And then if you want to go to the next slide, this was our second project using this model. This used, again, some of our own capital and then also an impact investment note, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about later. We've had some really interesting experience using these more creative financing vehicles. So I'll be happy to dive into that as we get into the question and answer section. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Stacy, next to you. Stacy Funderburk is Regional Counsel and Conservation Acquisition Associate with the Conservation Fund. So Stacy, to you.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be part of this panel discussion. I work in the Georgia office of the Conservation Fund. I've been with the fund for about 12 years, and we're a national nonprofit. We focus on land and water conservation around the country. We protected about 8.5 million acres to date, but a really important part of that is over 3 million of those acres are working lands, and that's working farms, working ranch lands, and working forests. And to make that kind of conservation happen, it requires thinking through a lot of innovative models, especially with land staying in private ownership, but getting conservation done. And Buy, Protect, Sell is a really important piece of that, particularly in the farmland context. And you've heard from a lot of people who've been doing this work at scale successfully for a long time. We also, in the Working Forest Fund context, we have put together a revolving fund and have protected almost 750,000 acres of working forests with a similar Buy, Protect, Sell model, with a goal of protecting over 5 million acres. So a long-term track record of being able to secure conservation capital to get these types of programs done at scale. And like AFT and a lot of the land trusts at the table here, we think there's a need to significantly scale up the capital and the partnerships needed for Buy, Protect, Sell programs around the country so that we can protect farmlands that are farmland at risk, support land access and ownership for next generation farmers, and expand the production of more local healthy food for communities. So I'm excited that in Georgia, we are launching our Working Farms Fund program in a larger metropolitan Atlanta area, a roughly 30 county region with a lot of farmland at risk, but a lot of aspiring next generation farmers who need that bridge to land access, and some very innovative partnerships that we'll get into on the market side to support those farmers and their farm businesses. We think this is a model in partnership with a lot of people who are at the table here that we can scale up in Georgia, but also replicate in many places around the country. So I'm really excited to be here with the experts discussing this. Thanks for having me.
Great, we are so glad. And last, John, good to see you now in person. And so I want to give you a minute to now formally introduce yourself in any way you see fit. Oh, you're on mute, John. John, you're on mute. No, you're still on mute.
I shouldn't be on.
There you go. Now we hear you.
Okay. Sorry.
Right, you're good.
It's the technology from Maine. Although Adam didn't have any problems. You already heard from me, but what I didn't mention then is the role that AFT is playing in this space, and 3 areas really. The first is policy, and I alluded it in that tape on our role with the federal farm bill and the role in rulemaking that continues. And so that's a big part of what we do as a national organization, is try to stay abreast of policy and promote policy that will support the whole land conservation movement. The second area where we have a role is in promoting and disseminating information, of which today is obviously an example. We want to see more groups engaged in this space and using this tool effectively.
And then the third area, which isn't playing out yet, but we hope to, is some direct partnerships, including with folks around this table. We've been having conversations for almost a year with the Conservation Fund about how we can support their efforts and they can support ours in this space. A lot of people don't realize that American Farmland is itself a land trust. It's a relatively small piece of our overall work, but we have held over 200 easements during our 40 years. We've assigned many of those to other groups as other groups got up and running, but we do have our own robust function, and we get engaged in parts of the country where there isn't an active agricultural land trust. And so we might very well be getting into some of our own BPS projects as well, particularly with the new opportunities created by the Farm Bill.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I am really, I am so grateful for the talent and expertise we have on this webinar. So we're going to start right in, and we're starting with questions that we've discussed as a panel. And then for you in the audience, some of these will cover some of the questions, but keep putting your questions in and we will toggle back and forth between the questions we've prepared and the ones that you all have, because I'm sure there are probably many. I want to start with a little bit just on the motivation and what got each of you into this line of work. I think John probably spoke for most land trusts, and Stacy, you talked a little bit about it from your perspective. You know, that it's both a combination of a land access tool and a way to protect vulnerable farmland. But Susan, as the lone sort of government agency on this panel, we know that there are a number of state, either departments of agriculture or other state agencies that have the authority to buy agricultural land in fee, but many of them sort of lease land, and it's not a sort of buy and resell. So can you talk a little bit about what got New Jersey into, what sort of motivated the states to play that role?
Sure. So, I mean, for New Jersey to be, you know, such a densely populated state, probably competition for land is the biggest thing that drives Buy, Protect, Sell, and that's what drove that first acquisition that kicked off the state program in '85. There was a developer who wanted to put, you know, 1,200 units of development like smack in the middle of Burlington County's Farm Belt. And the county, you know, stepped up and said, we have to stop this. So sometimes it's just the imminence of change of a really important piece of land that kind of forces hands. And so that's been a very important tool to have when we've needed it. And then secondly, you know, I think sometimes we're dealing with landowners who just don't want to sell an easement. You know, sometimes a landowner is ready to retire and they don't have children to pass the farm down to. And despite our kind of sales pitch, they're not quite believing that the preserved farm is going to be worth still quite a bit of money. So they're not sure they're going to be able to be made whole by selling the property in pieces. So occasionally we just have to step in and buy the property and take that landowner out, you know, and then resell the property. And then I think the third piece is, you know, when we are doing deals in collaboration with open space partners, sometimes we have situations where, you know, well, the front 100 acres is farmland, but the back 30 acres, you know, is a stream corridor that, let's say, a county is trying to protect as part of a connected open space, right? And so the county is very interested and wants fee simple acquisition rights for the, you know, for the stream corridor, but the landowner is not interested in selling, you know, fee on one piece and an easement on the other. So again, I think by and large, it's mostly related to landowner motivation, which when you're in land, you know, preservation world, if you don't understand landowners' motivation, you're not going anywhere, right? So it's a tool that you can pull out and use to deal with a landowner when their motivations really are that they need to be bought out in fee. So those are, I think, some of the biggest dynamics that kind of got New Jersey involved in it.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit from a public agency perspective, since we're sort of on the initial piece of it? How is the acquisition, we'll get into a little bit from a land trust perspective, but from a public agency perspective, how does that acquisition process work? And like, what are things to think about if you're in a state or a county agency on that acquisition end that you have to go through?
So, I mean, first of all, of course, knowing that the applicable state laws, that apply to your transaction, and making sure you're checking those boxes. But, from one big difference between simply buying easements, which is by and large, the bailiwick of the most of our work is just in purchasing easements. But when we do a fee deal, it's different in that you're appraising the property in fee simple, all of the rights, not just those non-agricultural rights. So in New Jersey, that tends to lead to a much higher value, right? I mean, our easements are somewhere in the neck of the woods of 50 to 60% of the fee simple value of land in our state as a gross, average, rough average. So when we look to purchase a property in fee, it can sometimes, double the value of what we're buying. So it's more expensive. But I actually think the bigger piece is the environmental due diligence that has to be done. When we acquire easements, we do a typical search to make sure there's no kind of smoking gun in the public records about a property having contamination issues. And as long as there aren't, then we just appraise and we acquire. But when we're talking about fee simple and acquiring the property in total, and we're going to step into the shoes of the owner and become in that line of title, your liability exposure increases dramatically. So there we do what we in New Jersey call a phase 1 and a phase 2 environmental review, and so when that environmental review gets done and they say, hey, there's an oil tank that never got properly closed, well, then it has to be examined, it has to be defined, it has to be cleaned up, and we have to have all the paperwork to make sure we have a clean property that we're passing on to the farmer. So fee simple transactions take a lot longer for us, and they're definitely more expensive on the front end, mostly because of environmental due diligence and just the nature of the real estate cost. I think those are the two biggest issues.
Right.
And I just want to quickly note, and we can move on, in New Jersey, we don't have a law that says we can kind of pick new and beginning farmers to sell our farms to, right? So we have a constitutional obligation and a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers to get the best price we can for land that we sell. And obviously that's not a great thing when you're looking to try to support the next generation of farmers. So I think, one of the things we're going to be focusing on in the next 5 years is to seek statutory authority, from the legislature to sell our properties, at less than highest market value so that we can engage the next generation of farmers and make land more affordable. But that as a state agency is not something you automatically have the authority to do. And in New Jersey, we're going to need to be given that authority by the legislature.
I'm really glad that you said that, Susan, because I think for some of the folks who are on this call that represent agencies who are thinking about this, to be able to build that in as they're thinking about that statutory authority right up front. I will note that the state of Rhode Island has a couple of years ago, enacted its Farmland Access Program, which is a formal buy, protect, sell program. And that did have language in it that I think said that it would prefer new and beginning farmers, or that was one of the many types of preferences they could provide. So if people are interested, there's an example on that front. So moving on and going to the heart of the matter, which is the financing and how you put these kinds of projects together. And again, I love John's way of sort of buy high, sell low, and the challenges that creates. So let's start with the financing, and particularly that initial financing of how you pay for that, how you raise that capital for the initial acquisition. Adam, again, since MFT has been in this business for a long time, can you talk a little bit more in a little more detail than what John provided in his intro about some of the ways that MFT is financing that initial purchase?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. As John mentioned in his introduction, like the earlier versions of our BPS deals were sort of funded by a loan pool that we had of sort of socially conscious investment capital, where we were getting loaned money and being able to use it for buy, protect, sell deals and paying back these investors a small percentage annually and being able to pay them back their initial investment over time. We still do some of that, but by and large now, most of our buy, protect, sell deals, the initial acquisition piece is at least in part funded by conventional bank financing. We've been sort of doing this long enough and have somewhat of a good enough track record that we were able to secure a multi-million-dollar revolving line of credit with a conventional bank that is sort of there at the ready for us to use when we have a BPS acquisition that comes across the transom for us. So rather than going and starting the loan process every time we're looking to acquire a piece of property, we have this line of credit set up that we're able to access and utilize pretty quickly, as quickly as the bank can usually turn the appraisal around. And you know, over the past few years, we use that financing for all of our buy, protect, sell properties purchases. It only will pay for 60% of the appraised value of the property. So you've got to come up with the other 40%. So that's, you know, where your investment funds that are being loaned to you or your philanthropic capital that you have on hand comes into play. Or maybe even better, a bargain sale from the seller of the property. But we've found that the conventional financing works for us. And that way you don't have to tie up as much of the philanthropic money that you have on hand, and it just offers us a little bit more flexibility.
Great, thanks. We will get into sort of project configuration in a minute, but Robin, to you, I know that Washington Farmland Trust that you mentioned at the outset, those couple of different approaches, including the use of an impact investment vehicle. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that looked like or looks like?
Yeah, so that looks, you know, a lot like what Adam just described in terms of a pool of funding from, you know, sort of socially conscious investors who, in this case, were since this was kind of our first foray into this realm, we rather than creating a pooled fund to use across multiple projects, we really kept it project specific, and so we were raising that capital, that investment capital for the specific project we targeted. And as Adam described, it's an impact note that's an unsecured note, you know, of debt to the trust. It's a 7-year note, so just kind of the terms of the financing, I guess. We wanted to give ourselves a long runway to get the deal done, and so we chose 7 years as the term of the note, hoping to give ourselves ample time, but also something that investors could tolerate. It pays 2% annually to the investors, so below market rate, but they are getting a small return on the investment. That particular deal, we brought about, it was a $3.4 million fee acquisition. We brought about $700,000 in philanthropy, but the remainder was raised through that impact investment. And we again, just, this being our first kind of go around in this, only the second buy, protect, sell deal, and definitely the first time we'd ever worked with impact investment funding. It was a learning process. We, had to hire a securities lawyer and, figure out how to, create that investment vehicle. I think start to finish, it took us about 9.5 months to raise the balance of the capital we needed, and that came in the end from, I think, around 16 or 17 individual investors and one foundation. Yeah, I mean, happy to go into more detail if it's helpful, but really, it was exactly that tool that Adam described, using investment capital from people who are interested in our mission and interested in seeing, farmland conserved, to understand the constraints around the public funding we're able to use, and we're excited to be involved in helping us, raise a new source of more flexible capital who were interested in making an investment rather than just a gift to the trust, but we're willing to take a lower return in order to see the impact. And yeah, I think does that answer?
That's very helpful, and I think that's a good way for people to think about that. It's a different way of attracting new interest in investors in something other than just a sort of typical donor to a land trust. So that's very helpful.
Yeah,
Stacy, turning
before you move on,
yeah.
On that particular note, it was a successful way of attracting folks, and we did have some concerns going into it that offering this as an option to people already familiar with our work might essentially cannibalize some of our philanthropy. We might offer this and have people who were making philanthropic donations regularly say, well, gee, I might as well get my 2% return. I'm gonna go this route instead. And it didn't end up really having that effect in the end. We were able to continue to keep, if for the investors who had been donors already, we were able to keep them on as donors, and this was really a way to increase their impact over and above whatever philanthropic contribution they were making to the organization. So for what it's worth, that was a concern, but did not play out nearly to the extent that we thought it might.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful to know. Stacy, turning to you, and given what you said at the outset about the Conservation Fund and your ability to provide some bridge financing, I gather that Washington Farmland Trust did finance one of their purchases with a bridge loan from the Conservation Fund. Is this a service that other land trusts could look to from the Conservation Fund? Can you talk a little bit about what those opportunities might be?
Sure, absolutely. And I mentioned in the intro, I talked more about projects where we were stepping out and directly using our revolving fund and carrying out projects, but we also have a conservation loan program that has been in place since about 1993, and that is largely working with local land trusts all around the country to help bridge finance deals that they've largely put together themselves, and they're lining up the funding, but it's really that bridge capital that they need help with on the front end of acquisition or within a certain amount of takeout. So the Washington Land Trust is a great example of that. We've loaned about $250 million around the country to about 400 different organizations through that program. Reggie Hall runs that program for us, and it has been really successful. I think around a quarter of those loans have gone towards agricultural land protection. Obviously, for all the reasons you've already heard, that is a significant part of conservation focus in many local for many local municipalities and states and land trusts working in those areas. So as you might guess, buy, protect, sell projects have been an important component of that agricultural work that's been done through the loan program. We have made multiple loans to Vermont Land Trust. You heard about Washington, a lot of work in the Northeast. I think last year we made $1 million loan to Kestrel Land Trust to carry out a dairy farm buy, protect, sell project they were working on. And it has been a really good tool. I think that, again, there's so much expertise in these land trusts. And so when it is really just, trying to bridge that transaction where they know how to pull down the funding and it's a matter of getting that capital in the door, the loan program is a really great tool. Where it can get a little challenging is these are, and they're very competitive loans, I will say too. It's a very good rate versus going to a market or going, trying to get, typically, I think Maine may have a good situation, but like typically getting a line of credit with the terms that would allow you to do something like buy, protect, sell is quite difficult. So good terms, and also we're a conservation organization, so working with that loan team to try to figure out the collateral and the pieces and the stack of capital, they get it. And so they're really easy to work with. They live and breathe in this space. So that's helpful. One challenge is that, in addition to what John mentioned, there are certain areas where we need new buy, protect, sell programs, right, where we don't have that entity in place. So in Georgia, that's where we're interested in stepping in directly. But then these are also relatively short-term loans. So they tend to be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, but you can't always carry out a full buy, protect, sell project where you step into ownership over that time frame. So it won't work every time for buy, protect, sell, but it has been very helpful, I think, over the years, and we work with a lot of different land trusts. So if you have anyone on the call or if you have questions, please reach out, and I'd be glad to put you in touch with Reggie Hall, who runs that program. And I know every real estate deal is different, but I guarantee you they've run across a similar example of whatever you're putting together. So feel free to reach out anytime. And I happen to be on the loan committee for that program too. So I care a lot about that program too. I've been on the loan committee for about 6 years. So.
Great. Okay, thank you. So this is a question, I'm taking a couple of these audience questions, and this might segue us into the carrying cost question, the sort of second half that John talked about at the beginning. Here's a question to you, Robin, which is, how do you pay those investors back? You've offered to pay them 2%. So does that gets put into your carrying costs, right? In terms of thinking about what that looks like. But do you want to sort of then segue into, let's talk a little bit about carrying costs, and for particularly if you have you talked about having a 7-year note. So how are you thinking about paying all of those costs, and particularly that investor piece?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's no doubt that part of being able to pay the debt service on that investment capital is it relies on philanthropy. So that's part of our model, is that we are going to have to raise and use a certain amount of philanthropic money to pay the debt service and to sustain those carrying costs. And then ideally, once we are able to sell the fee interest in the property back to a farmer, then within that 7-year time frame, then we'll be able to pay the investors back their initial investment and ideally recoup that $700,000 in philanthropy that we put in up front in order to turn that around towards the next project. But I think realistically, and as I mentioned up front, we're right in the middle of this. We're that second project I featured in the slides, the one using the impact investment. We purchased the fee in 2018, so we're kind of two and a half years into that 7-year time frame, and the carrying costs are substantial, and I think it's unlikely we will recoup all of that $700,000 in philanthropy that we put in up front. Part of that has turned out to be because we're trying to reconfigure the property to achieve sort of a multiple benefit scenario. The way I think Susan mentioned, it's a property that has about 100 acres of really critical riparian habitat for salmon spawning. So it's a couple of projects wrapped into one in that respect. And so the reconfiguring of the property is turning out to be a pretty lengthy and expensive process as well. And I'm happy to go more into that if it's helpful. But just to say, yeah, the carrying costs are substantial. Philanthropy definitely has to play a part in carrying that and paying the debt service.
Right. Okay, great. There was a quick question also for you, Robin. Did you bring the investors together, or did you work with an existing group of investors?
We brought them together.
Okay, right. That's
yeah, so we convened a task force in sort of preparation for launching, to basically help our staff, a task force of a few current board members and some people who have experience in the impact investment world, and folks who were really, understood more complex conservation financing structure. We basically convened them to help us design the note that we were going to offer and help us kind of do some feasibility. And so once we got through kind of the feasibility, period, and, decided we were going to move forward, we kind of helped kind of use that task force of folks who've been working closely with us and who were close advisors and who had experience and who also knew people, new impact investors who were interested in this kind of work. We basically used that task force to help us then, bring in folks and kind of launch the opportunity to their circles as well. So yeah, we were able to bring folks together.
Great. Okay. One last sort of initial acquisition question, then we're going to go again more on the sort of carrying costs. Susan, this is for you. The question is, where does the funding come for fee acquisition for your program? Is it a different pool of funding than easement acquisition?
No, it's the same pool of funding, and so the statute allows the funding to be used for either easement or fee acquisitions.
Okay. And then there was another one, which is BuyProtect sell really faster than a traditional easement transaction, given the need for the due diligence, particularly? I think the answer to that is that it's a sort of it's a different transaction entirely, right? Different. The motivation, as you were talking about from the landowner, is very different, so that you sort of can't equate the two, right?
Yeah, and when you're using taxpayer money, you have to be really careful what you do, and not to say that land trusts like risk, but public agencies are inherently allergic to risk, and so we really have to dot I's and cross T's. And so for us, a BuyProtect sell definitely takes longer to accomplish than a typical easement transaction, simply because of the environmental due diligence you must do and clear.
Right. Okay. So let's go. We have lots of great questions, but I want to get us through sort of some of the basics. Again, let's talk about project structure. And I can't remember, I think maybe Robin, you talked about reconfiguration, and reconfiguration being an important part of this. And when we say reconfiguration, that you might buy a property and you may not protect it and resell it in the same format. And in some cases, limited development is an option on the more marginal farmland to make the numbers work. And in other cases, there's sort of other reasons for reconfiguration. So is there somebody who wants to start on that sort of in what circumstances do you reconfigure a property? And how does that help to make the numbers work?
I mean, I can jump in. Again, to us, it gets back to both what is the landowner motivation and then what is the funder's motivation, right? So depending on whose money you're using, if we're getting money from the Audubon Society or from Fish and Wildlife as partners, well then, that's going to in part drive both their interest in putting money into the deal, and it's going to drive the outcome of the deal. Whereas if we're just strictly doing a farmland protection approach, we don't necessarily have to put a different easement or a more complex easement on this habitat. It probably would just be subject to our normal farmland easement. I find that family situations are often a driver for reconfiguration, like mom and dad own the ground, but the one daughter is a farmer and the sons aren't farming, right? And so we're trying to construct the transaction to take care of all of their needs, configuring it such that we get enough money back out of it. But particularly if you're in a land trust situation, being able to turn around and sell one of those pieces back to the daughter, let's say, who's farming, right? So again, it's all about what are the motivations of the landowners who own it, and are they going to be a piece of the activity or the transaction after you buy it in fee? Is a piece going back to that family, right? And understanding what is that, and then of course the motivations of your buyers. But I think, and particularly with climate change, right, and as we're all starting to wrestle with water management and water quality even more and more than we have, at least in New Jersey, over the last 30 years, I think that's going to start becoming a driving factor. Places that used to be just part of the farm now are being looked at as part of our flood capacity for the community going forward. Right. And so I could see transactions that we buy a property and fee, and a municipality or a county is participating to purchase a piece of that property to maintain an active floodway in perpetuity, and those kinds of factors. So, we're all here talking through American Farmland Trust, but as we all know, when you look at a farm, it's not just farmland. It's this whole panoply of environmental resources, right? From habitat to water quality to flood capacity to who knows what else. So all of those things are on the table when the acquisition happens, and are certainly going to drive how you divide it into pieces and sell those pieces. One interesting advantage, I think, of the nonprofit community and the land trust community is I think you have more flexibility than state government does. Like if we use farmland protection money to buy a property in fee, including a house, let's say somebody's got a 6,000 square foot house on a farm, that's kind of a drag, to try to sell that in an affordable fashion to the next generation of farmers, right? So from a land trust perspective, I would be interested to hear if there's experience in buying a piece of property, carving off the expensive house and selling that separately, and then being able to bring down the value of that residual farmland to sell to a farmer. As a state agency, I can't do that. Once we use the taxpayers' money that's been dedicated to farmland protection to buy the house in the first place, I can't sell it, without those farmland protection restrictions on it. So I think could be an interesting difference between the two kind of potential buyers, whether you're a nonprofit land trust or a state agency.
So who would like to answer that, John?
Yeah, I can jump. Well, first off, Susan made some great points, and really the biggest point, which I really want to drive home, is that reconfiguration is an important part of what makes Buy, Protect, Sell a really useful tool, and it works on many different levels. And Susan mentioned a couple of them: the ability to maybe carve out a house lot or carve out an expensive house. A situation that in Maine we typically encountered, at least in my time there, and Adam can speak to this later, but probably still the case. A lot of the farms that are on the market are larger dairy farms. And although a lot of folks entering farming might love the idea of owning a 500-acre dairy farm, they first off can't afford it, even with an easement on it. And secondly, it's really not tailored to what they want to do. You know, they're looking at some land for vegetables, maybe some small livestock, maybe a woodlot, but they don't need 500 acres. They are looking for 150 acres. So when you can right size the farm to a potential farmer's real needs and interests, it makes it, not only you bring the value down by selling them fewer acres, but you're making the size of the farm congruent with their business plan, which then makes it possible in many cases for them to even think about a sale. So at Maine Farmland Trust, we used reconfiguration to sell off house lots that were on marginal land. We used it when farmland protection made sense for one, but a wildlife interest or some other source of funding would be interested in another piece of the property. And we used it to take a farm and perhaps turn it into 2 or 3 farms in some incidents. And I'll tell you, the flip side of this is when you approach projects this way, it excites donors and investors because they see that you're being entrepreneurial and creative. And a lot of the folks who have money out there are folks who have been entrepreneurial and creative themselves and have made money in business, and they really respect you taking this kind of an approach. And you asked Chris how it affects the bottom line. What you're basically doing is figuring out a strategy to either get a better funding source or the highest and best value that a farmer buyer can still afford by configuring the property in a way that works for all those different needs.
Great, that is very helpful. I think what we're going to do, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the farmer rancher. We should always include ranchers in here. Buyer, and then we can come back and talk more about sort of carrying costs and project structure if we have time. But I want to get to the farmer buyer. And there's sort of lots of questions that I'm sure people have. How do you identify the buyer? What kind of interim arrangements do you have with that farmer or another farmer before the land is sold in fee? And what kind of support are you providing those potential farmer buyers? And Maggie, sorry that I have not directed a question to you yet, but this is now squarely in your wheelhouse, given how big an emphasis that VLT has placed on farmland access. And so if you could start in a little bit on how do you identify potential buyers, and are you purchasing properties or reconfiguring properties with specific farmers in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I've had such a good time just listening in, and learning, and I think that there's so many like great nuggets to touch on, and so I think this is a really valuable conversation. Yeah, so a big part of my role is engagement with farm seekers. Broadly, we maintain a farm seeker sort of list where we advertise properties that are either conserved or properties that we own in fee and are looking to sell, or properties where we're looking to help the landowner find a farm buyer to complete a conservation project. And so, of that list, I sort of maintain my kind of priority farm seeker list of people who I get to know through that process, who I feel like are really in a position where they're ready to start their farm business. So we're looking at, farming experience, financial capacity, business planning experience, other social capital in the community, relationships, those kinds of things. Generally, we don't go out and sort of look for farms on behalf of specific people. I think that's something that the organization did more historically, and it just is a big, time suck. And what I always tell farm seekers is like, you are going to be your best advocate out there in the world looking for a farm, and so like you're gonna work the hardest for yourself, and I'll try to work hard for you too, but I'm also working hard for a lot of other people. And so a big part of my role with them is honestly demystifying the conservation process and all the other tools that we have at our disposal, because I think people know, like, I think I can work with land trusts on access, but I don't really understand what you do. And if you're not in this world, it's a bit of a mystery. And so that's kind of the first thing I try to do, is help farmers understand what role we can play, what we need from them, what else they may need to do to be ready. And so many times farmers bring properties to us. And in some of those cases, we may purchase the farm in fee with the eventual transfer to them in mind, if that is the sort of the scenario that's going to lead to the best outcome. And so something that we've learned over the years is that giving farmers a longer sort of glide path to ownership is really valuable for some people. Some of that is due to their inability to access financing if they haven't run a farm business in the state before. Some of that is just a lack of sort of experience on the ground on the farm that they're on. And so we do use fee acquisition and this buy, protect, sell model to sort of slowly transition ownership to people who identify farms that work for them. Sometimes they're able to work out an arrangement with the landowner and we don't have to own the farm in fee. So again, like it's one of these tools in our toolbox, and when it's needed and it's appropriate, we utilize it. It's also really helpful to utilize it when there's a water quality sort of outcome that we could be involved in. So there's a restoration project where our ownership will lead to, further enhancements of the property around buffers or wetland restoration or something of that matter. Maybe there's a public access component where our ownership for a period of time will help to move that other programmatic goal forward. And then sometimes landowners, sometimes we buy properties in fee because properties come to us that are really valuable, either from a conservation standpoint, they're a really great agricultural resource. There's some other special reason why we feel like, hey, we have this opportunity to buy this farm in fee and, kind of figure out the funding piece, figure out that buy high, sell low, like take some time to put the deal together. And search for a farm buyer in that time. And so in that case, we will do a competitive request for proposal process that lasts a few months where, we advertise the property and we seek a farm buyer. And occasionally we will do that process if we don't own the farm in fee, but it's more common for us to do it when we are an interim owner.
Thanks. I want to follow up on that just for a minute, because you mentioned an RFP, and I know, and I assume, Susan, that you have to do an RFP or you guys do an auction on the resale. But can you talk a little bit, when you do an RFP, Maggie, how you structure it and what land trusts we're thinking about? Like, oh, how do we not seem like we're favoring one farmer over another? And so if the way to do that is in part through an RFP, how do you structure that? And then I'd welcome anyone else's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is transparency in terms of what we're looking for. So laying out our criteria really clearly, the things that I mentioned before: experience, capacity to finance the property. And that's one where if we identify a farm seeker who we're really interested in working with and, financing right at that, if we own the farm, like, we can talk about this longer pathway to ownership and what a lease to own sort of model might look like. But I think management capacity, one thing that's coming up that's really interesting to me is like the business plans, sort of suitability to the easement as well as to the land base itself. So like, does this property really make sense to be this kind of business model? If it's a farm that involves a lot of processing, making sure to have those conversations with farm seekers about how that might fit into, the buildings that are on the property. So it always involves, open houses, meeting in person, although we couldn't do that during COVID. Or we had to I had to do like showings. And then, we run the proposals through a rubric, and we have an external committee of representatives from partner organizations who help us make that decision and are there for us to sort of, vet the applicants with. And then Yeah, so it's, yeah, representative from, you know, our Department of Agriculture or somebody from Extension, which it's really helpful. We reach out to references. So, you know, my hope is that it's a fairly transparent process, so people sort of know. And I think the other piece for me that's really important is, you know, the goal of our program is to, one of the goals is to support people who have, you know, potentially been in an insecure land situation. So somebody who's been leasing who, you know, really feels like their land access is somewhat tenuous, wanting to really support, you know, those people who need that sense of security. That ranks pretty high on my, you know, list when I think about who we want to select.
Okay, anybody else want to offer thoughts on that? Adam.
Chris, if I might jump in,
Yeah.
just something that Maggie said, I just wanted to sort of comment on when she talked about like the long runway to ownership. Certainly that is a hugely valuable thing that land trusts may be able to provide through Buy, Protect, Sell. But you know, I think it's also worth folks that are listening in to consider the other sort of side of that coin, in that the longer the runway to ownership, the more expensive it is for the land trust that's doing the Buy, Protect, Sell, the more risk there is in terms of things that may happen during your period of ownership or leasing that you may be responsible for. So, you know, while MFT has had a lot of BPS projects with really long pathways to ownership, and they are valuable, there's also a place in the model for the quick flip, faster, cheaper, easier, less staff time, still a land protection outcome that is good. And you know, so MFT, we do both, and you know, sometimes we do it even in a way that we have the buyer lined up and selected and under contract to buy the property from us before we even close on the fee purchase, where we may sell it to them on the same day even, or in a month or something like that. So lots of different models out there, and I think there's a place for all of them in the toolbox, if you will, but just sort of wanted to touch on that other piece and that other way of thinking about it.
Yeah, go ahead, Maggie, and then Robin.
Yeah, just quickly, I think I'm glad you mentioned that, Adam, and I think that was sort of the kind of simultaneous transfer was really how we did this work for so long. And I think there, through the acquisition of much lower cost capital, we now have the ability to think about, you know, certain scenarios where a longer term pathway would be valuable. And I think my experience, sort of external to the organization for some time, was seeing some projects where, you know, the plan was to transfer the farm in a year, and then financing was an issue, and then everyone was given another year, and then finance, and, you know, and it was like, well, what if we just said, like, let's just do 2-3 years from the beginning, and it doesn't feel like a sort of, you know, a disappointment each time. So I think that's where, like, the involvement of good partners in business planners or viability planners to really sit down and look at projections and say, like, you know, is the business going to be in a position here realistically to be able to access financing and to be able to close, or, you know, and to be able to continue operating. And so I think having all of those different options, and I think your the cost of your internal capital that you're using to own the property is a big piece of that. And so our ability to access, you know, 0.5% money has given us that, like, flexibility a bit.
Great. Robin, and then I want to, Stacy, then I have a question for you. Yes.
Yeah,
Robin.
just really briefly, I mean, this is, I just wanted to flag one other challenge we've experienced with the longer runway, which is just that with land prices being fairly volatile where we operate, we've seen the longer runway, which was intended to be a benefit to the future farm buyer, actually work against them in certain ways as land prices go up. And we've, you know, had the challenge of figuring out how do we, as a as a nonprofit land trust, establish fair market value and sell to them at an affordable rate without creating any private benefit in a scenario where the price of the land is rising rapidly, and the longer the runway we give them, the more that purchase price has the potential to just be a moving target that continues out in front of them. And just, again, to just really give credit where credit is due, I mean, I think the ability that Maggie and Adam both described to be able to have the tools and experience to do that quick flip when you need to, or, you know, really know what you're doing and have the low cost capital to do the longer runway as Maggie described. I mean, that's so valuable. And so, yeah, we still have a lot to learn from you all, but yeah, really impressive how that works on both ends, I think.
Right. That's great. The questions are piling up, but I did want to give, speaking of runways, I wanted to have Stacy talk for a minute. Obviously, Maggie, you talked a lot about this sort of the services and the value and the importance of having business planning. And so some of those wraparound services for your prospective farmer buyers. But Stacy, you mentioned at the beginning sort of market development support for prospective farmer buyers. And I'm wondering if you can just talk for a minute about what that is you were doing on that front.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're excited about launching the Georgia Working Farms Fund because we have all the same, we're trying to address a lot of the issues that everyone's talking about here. And I think given our track record and experience of acquiring land that is at risk of being lost and pulling down conservation dollars, we could go out and acquire 50 farms and ensure that they're conserved. We conserve them, they're protected forever. But we could also end up with 50 failed farmers, and we would have really missed a huge opportunity. So we have been thinking about that from the beginning and knitting together all the partnerships on the ground that are needed to make this successful for the farmers and for the local food system as a whole in Metro Atlanta. And one of the most exciting parts of that is that in December of last year, we signed an MOU with Emory, which most of you many may have heard of. There's Emory University in Atlanta, but they also are a hospital system. So they run 14 or 15 hospitals in Metro Atlanta. So they are the largest employer in the entire Metro Atlanta area. So they also have some very ambitious commitments to sustainability, particularly on food sourcing for their students, their employees, and their patients. We were able to sign an MOU with them so that every farmer entering the Working Farms Fund program in Georgia will have the ability, not the obligation, to contract directly with Emory. And they are sharing their food purchasing data, information on their needs, and they're willing to forecast it out well in advance and enter into a separate contract, which we have a form template for that obviously can be negotiated with an individual farmer. So particularly for farmers that we're looking for our program, where they're looking to scale up production and access more institutional buyers and wholesale markets, obviously sometimes at a different price point, it's really attractive because it gives them a long-term contract and some certainty on the market side for purchasing their production over time. And it's also, I think, great to have someone like Emory at the table leading the way because their sustainability requirements, that gives you a built-in incentive for getting more sustainable practices on site with the farmers you're working with, because that's a requirement to sell to them. And they also want to lead the way for other institutional buyers. And in a place like Atlanta, there are plenty of other Fortune 500 companies with campuses there, other hospitals, the school system. Emory really wants to be a leader in that. So that's a huge advantage, I think, for our farmers, and we're really excited about that. Hopefully the beginning of many similar partnerships like that, because we really want them to have successful farm businesses in addition to securing this land for future generations of farmers.
That's super cool.
It really is.
It really is.
They've been great. They've been great to work with through this.
That's a great model.
And I'll say too that we worked closely with the Turner Environmental Law Clinic at Emory. They helped us figure out the food purchasing agreements, are, looked at different models around the country for lease with an option to purchase for our farmers. So it's been a tremendous partnership that Emory stepping up to the table with us. So
Wow.
it's really exciting.
That's great.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I thought that an hour and a half with an hour for a discussion would be somewhere even a little close to being enough. I knew but it wasn't anywhere close to enough. So we are going to launch a poll. I think we are thinking about doing this was Buy, Protect, Sell 101, and I suspect that there would be interest in a 201. But I do want to, we have time for maybe one question. And for those of you who ask questions, thank you for doing that. And we will be, this great group of panelists have agreed to help us answer these and put this Q&A back out. But here's a poll on do you feel, has this helped? If you were thinking about doing Buy, Protect, Sell, or if you were in the midst of one and it's opened your eyes, it would be helpful to know whether this has been useful. So if you could answer this one, and then we have one more. And then I'm gonna actually ask one last question because I think I can get that one in. Okay, Beth, do we have a way to answer? Do we see the poll results on that one? Okay, so I think that that answers our question on the need for a Buy, Protect, Sell 2.0. And here's the question of which of these, I don't know if you can, you can select all that apply, of which you would like us most to focus on in the next one. And to the panelists, I hope that you might be willing to rejoin us to talk about some of these things. And I will say on the last one, we have spoken to NRCS about doing a webinar that is specific to doing Buy, Protect, Sell through the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. We know that NRCS is working on developing additional guidance for that. And so that when that guidance is available, as John mentioned at the outset, that we will be providing more information on that front. But Beth, if we can just see what this looks like in terms of the results there. So that is, I can't actually see them because my question bar. All right, well, that's good. It's, I think it sounds like structure and ASEP are the highest, but lots of other questions. So let me ask you one last question to anybody who wants to answer this. If an entity ends up holding the farm for several years before reselling it, what happens to the farm production? Do you lease the land, or does it sit without being maintained? And so just for anybody who wants to answer quickly, what is the, how do you deal with that lease arrangement, and is land sitting idle? I'm going to guess that that answer is no, but in that interim, who's typically working the land?
I can just respond. Oh,
okay.
Go ahead, Maggie.
I was just going to say briefly, we're usually purchasing the farm knowing who the tenant, who the eventual buyer will be. So we really try to avoid having much time where we own the farm without use. And I think that can be a really challenging time if that does happen. We have had some experiences where farmers we selected didn't work out, and then the farm sat vacant, and it's really challenging. So
I would just add quickly, Chris, that we Jeff Everett in my office, he's the deputy director, and he really worked hard to try to change the terms of our leases. So we don't own a lot of pieces of land right now, and to create a lease that's more carrot than stick. Right, so clearly the land needs to be farmed, and we sign off on the farmland assessment. The state of New Jersey has to pay the host municipality payment in lieu of taxes, right? Because we're a tax exempt organization, but the municipality still gets paid. So, but we piloted an idea that allowed for a couple things, and one was we'd like to see better conservation practices employed on land that we rent, right? And so rather than just being all stick about that and saying thou shalt, when we advertised the RFP, we said, you know, this is a 2-year lease if you're just going to do normal, you know, traditional ag practices. But if you apply for and implement certain conservation practices that are needed on the farm, the lease extends to a 5-year lease, you know? And at the end of that 5 years, if you wanted to extend it, then here's kind of phase 2 of the conservation practices we were looking for. And then the cost, the farmers, renters costs of implementation is an offset against the lease, right? So it's like, we're holding this property for reasons we won't get into today for an extended period of time, but we'd really like to see it well taken care of. That's what we want to see of more than, you know, getting a pittance of a kind of a lease payment. So it's an opportunity, right, to, you know, and it could even go to places where the farmer who's renting the land could potentially agree to be a mentor to a new and beginning farmer as part of their lease obligation, right? So we're sort of dabbling with those ideas and trying to figure out how can we get the most out of the lease that's a win-win for both us and the next generation and the land, you know, the quality of the stewardship.
Interesting. That's great. That is very helpful. I think maybe, given that we're a little over time, that we're just stop there. I want to thank you all. I hope that you all might be willing to come back for 2.0 because it sounds like there's a lot of interest in that. And we will be in touch with everybody. We're going to send out a copy of, we'll send out this recording. We will follow up with the answers to the questions that folks have posed. And stay tuned because I think this means that there will be another version coming. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Thank you panelists. Thank you, John, for your introduction. Thank you, Beth, for the technology. Appreciate it all. And until the next time.
Okay,
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.